Good afternoon and welcome to our final day of IAC 2024 coverage here on The Angry Astronaut. What an incredible experience this has been. Interviewed all kinds of people from all over the world about space flight, about space science, about what their various companies and nations are doing to contribute to the advancement of space flight. Learned quite a lot since I've been out here. So before I start talking about Michael Bloomberg and his latest article, his latest effort to sabotage Artemis, at least with his supporters, who tend to pretty much focus around the left-wing side of the equation, liberals, although he also has his admirers all over the world, just wanted to make a quick mention that I am still running substantially in the red on this trip, and it wouldn't be much of a consideration if the content that I put out was extremely popular. But I have thousands of people who really like these sorts of conventions and the coverage that I bring, but it's not the most popular thing that I do. So it's a combination of the expense of coming out here and the fact that the content that I create just doesn't pull the kind of viewership that, say, my UFO stuff does, or if I'm critical of Starliner, that sort of thing. That being the case, then, if it's something that you would like to contribute to, all the details in the description. About $500 or so in the red, actually substantially more than that, but I just thought I'd throw a reasonable figure out there, which means I'd need a tiny percentage of my viewers to donate $5 a piece, and we'd be taken care of. However, if you are hard up financially, or this is something that would be difficult for you, I don't want your money, okay? It's not your responsibility to take care of my problems, but if it's something you'd like to contribute to, then please, by all means, do so in the description. Okay, that's enough of that. Now let's talk about Michael Bloomberg and his latest contribution to the destruction of human space flight, at least in the United States. So in the course of today's episode, I'm going to be quoting extensively from Michael Bloomberg's latest article about Artemis called NASA's $100 billion moon mission is going nowhere. And although a number of you will probably find out that I agree with a number of things that he has to say about Artemis, his overall conclusion is deeply, deeply flawed and actually a bit hypocritical. But let's go ahead and just plunge right into the article, and then I can give you my reactions. Quote, "There are government boondoggles, and then there's NASA's Artemis program. More than a half century after Neil Armstrong's giant leap for mankind," keep in mind, giant leap for mankind, so he seems to look upon Apollo as being a positive thing, Artemis was intended to land astronauts back on the moon. It has so far spent nearly $100 billion without getting anyone off the ground. That's true, yet its complexity and outrageous waste are still spiraling upward. The next U.S. president should rethink the program in its entirety. And for those of you who recall a lot of my content, I've said things rather similar to this, although I have not said that Artemis needs to be torn apart. I think that it has some problems. I think it needs some rectification, but I don't think it needs the kind of radical change, just shutting the whole damn thing down, the way you're going to see Bloomberg is recommending. Quote, "As someone who greatly respects science and strongly supports space exploration, the more I have learned about Artemis, the more it has become apparent that it is a colossal waste of taxpayer money. The problems start with the mission, which is more political than scientific. There is little humans can do on the moon that robots cannot." Okay, let's go ahead and plunge into that particular conclusion. That's an argument that's been raging for decades, and it's an argument that I come down strongly on the side of human exploration. In spite of all of the decades and all of the rovers that we have sent to the red planet, for example, we still don't know if there's life there. And the reason we don't know if there's life there is because the scientific equipment required to do all of the testing on the regolith, especially regolith several meters beneath the surface, is prohibitively heavy. And consequently, we found that we're going to have to send samples back from the red planet in order to determine exactly what might be lurking there, and the expense of doing this has proven to be absolutely outrageous, to the point to where the mission has been modified, canceled, reissued, etc. Unbelievably difficult just to get this simple task taken care of. Few grams or perhaps a couple of kilograms of material returned from the red planet, whereas a human mission could bring back potentially tons. And not only tons of regolith from the surface, but also samples from deep down inside the planet. And as hostile as Mars might be, the moon is much, much more hostile to robots. 14 days out of every 28, the moon is plunged into the kind of darkness and the kind of cold experienced only in deep space, with temperatures approaching absolute zero. This absolutely destroys most robots, and the ones that the CLIPS missions have sent to the lunar surface up to this point. Oh, and by the way, only one has actually managed to land successfully there. They all fail in a matter of days, simply because you can't keep a robot going under those conditions for very long unless you have a nuclear power plant on board, something similar to what Voyager 1 and 2 did, and something that is going to be increasingly problematic if you launch robot after robot after robot, all with nuclear power and nuclear fuels on board. It would take one anomaly to spread nuclear material all over the surface of the Earth, which would bring your entire lunar expedition to a close if you weren't extremely careful. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use nuclear, I'm just saying that sending large numbers of robots to the moon, all with nuclear power sources, could be equally problematic, if not worse, than sending human beings. Robots make excellent scouts, but if you're talking about in-depth research, if you're talking about mining materials that may be tens or even hundreds of meters beneath the surface of the moon, and if you want a single expedition to gather samples and materials from regions that may be tens or hundreds of kilometers away from the landing site, you can do that with humans in a single mission, whereas it could take years, if not decades, for a robot to achieve the same thing, assuming that your robot actually lasts that long. So let's continue. We do not need another person on the moon to collect rocks or take scientific measurements, and the costs of putting people on the moon and of planning for their potential rescue should complications arise are truly astronomical. I agree it's astronomical, but it's also definitely worth it. We'll continue. To understand the level of wasteful spending, forget the $1 billion in spacesuits that have yet to be delivered. That's pocket change compared to the rocket called the Space Launch System. And just to let you know, I saw the latest design for the spacesuits that have yet to be delivered. Axiom Space was only commissioned to do this a couple of years ago. It hasn't been that long, so really I think we're putting unrealistic expectations on them to deliver spacesuits that are suitable to one of the most hostile places in the solar system. And if you're going to criticize these new suits, Mr. Bloomberg, might I recommend that you make a trip to one of these conventions and check it out? You got way more money than I do to pay a visit to Milan. Anyway, let's continue with the Space Launch System, something that I'm likely to agree with Mr. Bloomberg on. The program has so far burned through $23.8 billion. Each launch will likely cost at least $4 billion, quadruple initial estimates. This exceeds private sector costs many times over, yet it can launch only about once every 2 years, and unlike SpaceX's rockets, can't be reused. Overall, I agree with most of that, although I think as we continue to launch the SLS, it's probably not going to cost $4 billion a launch, but we also need to take that in context with what Saturn V and the Apollo missions cost us surface in the old days, something that Mr. Bloomberg seems to approve of, and yet hypocritically doesn't seem to criticize the cost. But we'll go ahead and continue before we get to that. Even if the Space Launch System is completed, by the way, it is actually complete because it's been to the moon already, but we'll continue. There's a hitch. It isn't even powerful enough to actually get anyone to the moon, at least not in its current configuration. This is also not true. If the SLS were launching the Apollo LEM in the old days, in other words, if they simply reproduced what Apollo did, the SLS could definitely deliver it to the surface of the moon. The difference is it's launching a much larger expeditionary vehicle, the Orion. Sure, that's too heavy to get to the surface of the moon, and that's why it requires a more complicated infrastructure. So it will instead deposit its capsule, called Orion, into what's called a near rectilinear halo orbit. Here, the capsule, which despite $20 billion being poured into it, currently has a faulty heat shield. Keep in mind, he's criticizing Orion's faulty heat shield. Let's wait for the hypocrisy to get going here in a second. Must rendezvous with a landing spacecraft, which will then take the astronauts to the lunar surface. That landing spacecraft, by the way, is the SpaceX Lunar Starship. So a reusable rocket is actually included in Artemis's architecture. It's just not taking care of the whole thing yet. And getting the landing spacecraft into orbit before it can be propelled toward the moon to meet Orion is itself a complex process. It is indeed, and that's because Starship, the reusable rocket that he is advocating from SpaceX, that's what's complicated. And yet, he doesn't actually mention that in his article, that it is SpaceX that's the most complex part of the Artemis plan. But we will continue. Simple Artemis is not. A lot could go wrong, and that's before NASA adds its new space station into the mix. Known as the Gateway, it will cost more than $5 billion to build, require perhaps $1 billion in annual maintenance, and has no clear rationale. Totally disagree with that. We'll continue. The idea is that in future missions, Orion might dock at the Gateway. 2 astronauts will exit and board the lander, and the remaining crew will sit in the station and observe their colleagues collecting rocks. Let me go ahead and repeat that. Will sit in the station and observe their colleagues collecting rocks. I have never heard such an oversimplified and insulting way to describe astronauts' activities and their responsibilities in space, but we'll continue. Unfortunately, that's not all. To build Gateway, NASA is adding a second stage to the Space Launch System called Block 1B that is 6 years behind schedule. Yeah, the whole thing about SLS sucks. I'm not saying that it doesn't. Expected to cost $5.7 billion and will add about $1 billion to every launch. To accommodate Block 1B, the agency is erecting a new launch tower called ML2, which is expected to cost $2.7 billion, more than 7 times initial estimates. Yes, I've made many videos about how much that sucks and doesn't have a plausible completion date. The company building the ML2 has billed the government for 850,000 overtime hours in the past 2 years. A celestial irony is that none of this is necessary. None of this is necessary, he says. A reusable SpaceX Starship, the very thing he said is so complicated just a couple of paragraphs ago, will very likely be able to carry cargo and robots directly to the moon. Okay, this is oversimplified to a degree that almost makes me want to vomit, but we'll continue. No SLS, Orion, Gateway, Block 1B, or ML2 required at a small fraction of the cost. Its successful landing of the Starship booster was a breakthrough that demonstrated how far beyond NASA it is moving. He is absolutely full of in this statement. Let me go ahead and explain why. Starship is nowhere close to the point to where it will be able to put astronauts inside the fairing, inside the nose cone of Starship, lift off from Boca Chica or the Cape or whatever, travel all the way out to the moon, which requires 10 refueling missions in order to accomplish that. So 11 launches of the biggest rocket in human history, travel all the way to the lunar surface, and then come all the way back. Now, there is little question in my mind that one day Starship will be capable of doing this, but one day in the distant future, and let me explain why. Number one, Starship doesn't have an abort system, something that NASA requires as an absolute essential for anything they're going to put their astronauts in. So putting astronauts into Starship from the moment you launch it from wherever that happens to be is something that is unacceptable to NASA and really should be unacceptable to anybody. We have learned with the tragedies that took place with the space shuttle that having an abort system is extremely important. So what if you fly Starship up to orbit and then send up a Crew Dragon and transfer the astronauts that way? Not a bad idea. Of course, you still have 11 launches. You can't get past the physics of this. Starship can only reach low Earth orbit, as heavy as it is, and then it requires a complete refuel in order to get to the moon, especially if you're talking about a propulsive landing. But look at the Delta V budget that Starship has to overcome. Going to Mars, SpaceX intends to use the Martian atmosphere to slow down Starship to provide most of that deceleration and save on the Delta V budget to successfully land on the surface of Mars. The moon has no atmosphere, therefore it's going to require a 100% propulsive landing in order to set down on the lunar surface. Then you have to come back and somehow re-enter Earth orbit. You can't use Earth's atmosphere either, as Apollo did, in order to slow you down and save on the Delta V budget. You have to decelerate into an Earth orbit after you're returning from the moon in order to transfer the astronauts back to a Crew Dragon. I do not believe that Starship has the fuel necessary to handle that kind of Delta V budget. Elon has already admitted that Starship would require ISRU fuel for a Mars mission in order to be able to come back, and there isn't enough methane on the moon to provide ISRU fuel for Starship. And besides, we don't want to talk about ISRU refueling for a monster rocket like that for early Artemis missions anyway. Completely impractical, and it would probably delay Artemis 3 by at least 10 years to try to do things that way. And it gets even worse. Let's say that you don't want to do the transfer to the Crew Dragon upon return, but instead just use Starship to re-enter. Well, Mr. Bloomberg was so quick to criticize Orion's heat shield. Let's have a look at Starship's heat shield. And by the way, this is an improved heat shield with an additional layer of ablative shielding underneath the heat panels. As we can see, Starship is still quite a ways from being able to safely re-enter the atmosphere, and that's from Earth orbit. An Earth orbit re-entry is so much slower than a re-entry from a lunar trajectory. That's thousands and thousands of kilometers faster, meaning the temperature is hundreds of degrees hotter, meaning that this heat shield is going to be subjected to even more punishment, far more punishment than we have seen thus far. And although I'm confident that SpaceX will be eventually able to rectify this issue, right now we're not nearly close enough to having Starship to a mature enough level to use it for anything other than a lunar lander at the moment, exactly as Artemis currently has it planned. And while SLS remains the most powerful rocket to ever successfully orbit the moon, currently Starship is the most powerful rocket to unsafely land on the Earth. And the fact of the matter is, it's going to be a little while before Starship is the mature interplanetary transfer system that we really think it's going to be sometime, maybe next decade or something along those lines, but not quick enough for Artemis to make use of it to take care of the entire process. Not yet. But at the end of the day, isn't Bloomberg completely right about the space launch system and everything associated with Artemis right now? Is it not justifiable for us to just go ahead and shut this program down because it's just too expensive? Well, let's compare the cost of SLS to the cost of Saturn V and everything that we admire about the Apollo program and how they were able to accomplish what they did back in the 1960s and early 70s. Let me tell you something, they did it with a lot of money. First of all, the spacecraft side of things, $81 billion. By way of comparison, again, Bloomberg is criticizing the $20 billion that's been poured into Orion. Apollo spent quadruple that amount in adjusted dollars on their spacecraft. Launch vehicles, $23 or so billion invested in SLS thus far, $96 billion invested in Saturn V. Then development and operations, another $26 billion were invested for Apollo. $204 billion of direct project costs, plus $53 billion in ground facilities, salaries, and overhead, meaning that Apollo cost over 2.5 times as much as Artemis has up to this point, and that money was spent between 1960 and 1973. 13 years worth of budgeting as opposed to over 20 for Artemis, meaning that Artemis has actually cost the American taxpayers substantially less than Apollo did. Now, yes, Apollo did successfully land on the moon several times, but even if you are assuming $4 billion per SLS launch, that means 10 successful SLS missions could be sent to the moon for $40 billion, and you still would be nowhere close to the expense of Apollo. Now, I'm not saying that Starship could not eventually take care of this very same mission for a much lower cost at some point in the future, but I think I've spelled out in great detail why Starship is just not ready to take care of that yet. And unless we want to cede the moon to China, who is making enormous progress right now, and by the way, intends to carry out the early missions of their lunar campaign with expendable rockets until their Starship clone is ready to go, unless we're willing to just go ahead and lose this race now to China, we have to push forward with what we have and not shut down the latest attempt that we've made to try to return to the moon just because things are complicated, just because things haven't gone well thus far, and just because we're not willing to spend the money and the dedication that we did back in the 60s and early 70s. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, stay angry about space.